some suspensions to some players have undoubtedly changed the way that the league functions entirely.
He said, well, you're suspended a year. And I was like, a year? You can't talk to anybody in the league. You can't talk to any coach. You can't talk to any player. It was unprecedented.
As much as the league's superstars and championship teams have shaped the story of the sport, so have some pivotal suspensions. So let's take a look at 10 significant suspensions that changed NFL history. I suppose a natural place to start here is with Deflategate, one of the most well-known and often discussed suspensions to ever grace the NFL world. For anyone who is living under a rock for the multi-year odyssey that was Deflategate, the controversy stemmed from the 2015 AFC Championship game, in which Tom Brady's New England Patriots decimated the Colts 45-7 with footballs that may or may not have been slightly deflated. The official NFL rules state that game balls are required to be inflated to a gauge pressure between 12.5 and 13.5 psi. According to a report released by Ian Rappaport that February, there were anonymous league sources who indicated that 11 or 12 of the footballs used in the first half of the game were judged by officials to be a few ticks under the minimum PSI. And thus ensued an excruciatingly boring tennis match between the Patriots and the league that ultimately resulted in Brady serving a 4-game suspension to start off the 2016 season. Not only did it inspire Brady to play one of the best seasons of his career, which culminated in the 28-3 comeback against the Falcons in the Super Bowl, but it also caused the NFL Rules Committee to change the inspection rules as it sought to lay out a more stringent testing and monitoring process. But more interestingly here is the ripple effect that this suspension ended up having, as it's believed to have further driven a wedge between Brady and his longtime coach, Bill Belichick. Brady was allegedly peeved at Bill for his comments at the initial Deflategate presser, during which the quarterback believed his coach hung him out to dry, particularly with his saying, "Tom's personal preference on his footballs are something he can talk about in much better detail than I can possibly provide." Although the duo found a way to coexist for 4 more seasons, capturing 2 more Super Bowls in the process, I might add, it seemed clear that their relationship wasn't the same. Bountygate, which took place down in New Orleans under the watch of Saints head coach Sean Payton and defensive coordinator Greg Williams, is really the only other suspension in recent history to cause a media firestorm that was at all comparable to what took place during Deflategate. And like Deflategate, Bountygate ended up changing the course of NFL history. Payton's regime was accused of and found culpable for creating and participating in a bounty program that incentivized the Saints defensive players to target certain players on opposing teams during a stretch that spanned from at least 2009 to 2011. The Saints first found themselves under the microscope following a 31-28 overtime victory against the Vikings in the 2009 NFC Championship game. After which, Vikings players, coaches, and officials claimed that Saints defenders were intentionally trying to hurt their 40-year-old quarterback, Brett Favre. The NFL eventually discovered that Favre was not the only target in 2009, and this was not an isolated incident. It alleged that Arizona Cardinals quarterback Kurt Warner was also targeted during those same playoffs, as well as Green Bay Packers quarterback Aaron Rodgers and Carolina Panthers quarterback Cam Newton during the 2011 season. The NFL suspended Payton and linebacker Jonathan Vilma for the entire year. Williams was banned indefinitely, and a cascade of other individuals who were involved were also handed significant suspensions. Not only did New Orleans struggle over the next few seasons as a result, they also seemed to pick up a bit of a hex along the way, as karma now continues to catch up with them when it matters most during the postseason. Beyond the impact it had on the people involved, Bountygate put the NFL, which was already battling a public perception issue, in a very challenging position, as it drew attention to its violent, high-stakes nature and the reactive measures to make football safer that the league has continued to make in the time since has completely changed the sport as we know it. While we're on the subject of the NFL's propensity for reactivity, suppose now is a good time as any to talk about the Ray Rice suspension, which undeniably changed the league, in this case for the better. The suspension stemmed from an altercation between Rice and his now wife, Janae, in an elevator at the Revel Casino in Atlantic City. The cameras caught the two stumble into the elevator clearly inebriated, and a verbal dispute broke out. Janae appeared to spit in Ray's face, and he lost it, instinctively swinging and knocking his wife unconscious. Rice was then seen dragging his unconscious wife out of the elevator. Well, obviously, news broke of the incident, and the NFL suspended Rice for the first 2 games of the upcoming season, which drew ire from critics, believing that to be too light for a domestic violence-related suspension. But the Ravens, and frankly, the NFL league office, stood behind the punishment. That is, until the video leaked. After which, nothing was the same. Ray was subsequently released and suspended by the NFL indefinitely, which was successfully appealed on the grounds that he was illegally suspended twice for the same offense. But the damage was done, and Rice was untouchable. He never played another down in the NFL. Obviously, domestic violence is an extremely serious issue, and it really shouldn't be taken lightly. But there is no denying that Rice was used as a sacrificial lamb by the NFL to change the narrative around its domestic violence problem. The bright side here is the NFL has taken these issues much more seriously in the time since, and now doles out far more significant suspensions when domestic violence is involved in the player conduct policy violation. Interestingly, there are some parallels that can be drawn to the way that the league handled Michael Vick's involvement in the Bad News Kennel scandal. Vick was initially suspended indefinitely, but upon his release from prison, he ended up on the exempt list, setting a precedent for the NFL to essentially keep players on that list while they deliberate on the best way to move forward. For those of you who don't know, by the letter of the law, any player that is placed on this list is required to remain away from all team activities, generally until his legal proceedings are dealt with. The player, however, is still paid while on the list, and this has become the default strategy when the NFL is unsure of how to discipline a player. Obviously, involvement in illegal dogfighting rings is not the same reoccurring issue that domestic violence is, but it did open up Roger Goodell's eyes to a new way to leverage the commissioner's exempt list, which only a handful of players had landed on up to that point. Adrian Peterson is another famous example of a superstar that ended up on the commissioner's exempt list, and his subsequent suspension in 2014 also changed NFL history. At the time, Peterson was the single best running back in the league, no questions asked. He had rattled off 6 1,200-yard seasons in the first 7 years of his career, and the only year he missed, 2011, he played just 12 games due to a torn ACL. In 2014, that all came crashing down when the news broke that Peterson had been indicated on child abuse charges, landing himself on the aforementioned exempt list. Not only did this make a huge dent in his image, it also resulted in him missing the entirety of the 2014 season, burning one of the last years of his prime and putting the Vikings in a pretty much unwinnable situation. This is not too dissimilar to what we saw play out with Josh Gordon. His suspensions were handed down for different reasons, violating the league's substance abuse policy. But it undeniably derailed his career in the same way that Peterson's did, while he was at the top of the league in his respective position. This set back the Browns organization once again, which, let's face it, they didn't have the talent to absorb this kind of loss. They were losing a player that was so talented, he looked to be on the verge of establishing himself as a perennial All-Pro. While he has found his way back into the NFL, he has never quite regained that form. Instead of a potential Hall of Famer, Gordon became one of the all-time NFL what-ifs. Geno Smith is another instance of a player who had his career changed by a suspension. The only catch? He wasn't even the player hit with the suspension. It was Ike Enemkpali who was hit with it for hitting Geno in the face and breaking his jaw over an unpaid $600 debt. Smith's fractured jaw, however, did sideline him, and while Smith nursed his wounds, Ryan Fitzpatrick slid in and led the Jets to a 2-0 start. As a result, head coach Todd Bowles ended up relegating Smith to backup duties long term, which he's largely been resigned to in the time since. Quite a fall from grace for Smith, who was the second quarterback taken in his 2013 draft class. Staying in the AFC East, Richie Incognito's suspension from the Dolphins in the fallout of the Bountygate scandal back in 2013 definitely sent a ripple through the NFL history books. In total, the offensive lineman ended up missing 24 games, 8 from direct suspension, and he missed an additional 16 games the following year as no team would touch him. He did, however, get a chance with the Buffalo Bills in 2015, where he went on to earn 3 more trips to the Pro Bowl, which ended up being rather serendipitous for Buffalo. More importantly, Incognito's transgressions against teammate Jonathan Martin and a number of team staffers ultimately changed the way that many in and around the NFL looked at football culture and hazing, which has been central to locker rooms since the beginning of time. On the other side of the trenches, former All-Pro defensive tackle Albert Haynesworth also had a suspension back in 2006 when he was a member of the Titans. That most certainly shook up the NFL. Unlike Incognito's, Haynesworth incident actually took place on the field during the third quarter of a game against Dallas. After a Cowboys touchdown, Dallas center Andre Gerard fell to the ground and Haynesworth took it upon himself to slide his helmet the rest of the way off and stomp on his exposed skull. The NFL doled out a historic 5-game suspension, just the second multi-game suspension from an on-the-field incident in league history. Fortunately, it helped set the precedent for disciplining players for this kind of behavior, like we saw in 2011 when Ndamukong Suh got 2 games for stomping on the arm of Evan Dietrich Smith. And last but not least, we have an old-school one, the suspension of Merle Hapes, one of the first big anti-gambling suspensions. He and his quarterback, Frank Filchuk, were involved in a gambling scandal in 1946, in which they allegedly took bribes to fix the NFL championship game. As a result, he was suspended indefinitely and essentially banished off to Canada, where he played the rest of his pro football days in the CFL. This set the tone for how the NFL would deal with gambling-related scandals going forward. But which suspensions do you think changed the NFL history books the most? Join us in the comments section below. If you like this video and learned a thing or two, clicking the like button helps out a ton. And hey, we appreciate it. If this is your first time coming around to TPS though, subscribing is a great idea because we put out videos like this every single day. But as always, thanks for watching and we'll see you guys next time.